Hello again, and welcome to the next of our recorded lecture topics. We've finally gotten to the Civil War, and so the Civil War is in some ways kind of the massive turning point event in virtually all of American history. It makes for a really great dividing line with American history survey classes in colleges. It makes for a good sort of pivot point for a lot of aspects of American life and politics and society and economics and culture before and after that particular event. So I will apologize once again real quick because I have one cat down here with me in my basement, and another one is madly trying to pry open the door so that he can get down into the basement. So if you hear noises, there's all kinds of stuff going on right now, so I apologize for that. But you know, we're all we're all making the best of a bad situation, I guess, in some respects with some things. So again, make sure that you are keeping on top of the full PowerPoint content on Blackboard. Make sure that you are getting in touch with me whenever you have questions or concerns that you need to bring to my attention. This particular topic is going to be broken down into 4 or 5 different chunks. Some of them, like today's, maybe a little bit shorter than others. So I tried to do my best to break them by sort of reasonable kinds of content so that we weren't having these weird jarring kinds of breaks and transitions and things like that. So we'll get into some of the background for the war, talk then a little bit about the progress of the war, and we'll follow it roughly kind of chronologically from the very first shots in April of 1861 all the way through the surrender in April of 1865. And so that's kind of the overall plan that we have as far as how we're going to approach the content. So the Civil War is a little bit more complicated than it is often portrayed as, right? Than it's often represented as. So more often than not, the war is kind of treated as the North was against slavery and wanted to get rid of slavery, where the South was in favor of slavery and wanted to keep it. That's only partially true, and it's only partially accurate. Yes, slavery was in many ways at the root of the tension between northern states and southern states. But when the war begins, and when secession starts in December of 1860, when the southern states begin to leave the United States, the war is really about the question of maintaining the Union, right? Maintaining the fusion of all of the states together into a single country. And these 2 recruiting posters are kind of really interesting because they represent that issue pretty well. For instance, on the left, you have a recruitment poster from South Carolina, and nowhere on there does it say anything about we need a war so that we can protect our right to maintain slavery as an institution. Certainly that is at the core of what's happening. And certainly people on both sides knew that slavery was right at the center of all of this. But in a lot of respects, the rhetoric of the beginning stages of the war really tend to circle back to the question of what America represents as a political entity, right? And on the left-hand side, you have at the very bottom of that poster the years 1776 to 1860. And that's not a coincidence, right? The people who were creating this particular recruitment poster were very deliberately hearkening back to the idea that what South Carolina was doing by breaking away from the United States was exactly the same as what the American colonies were doing when they decided to break away from the British Empire. The idea that, well, we exist as part of a political entity that doesn't reflect our wishes, that doesn't speak on our behalf, that marginalizes us when compared to other interests in the country and in the government. And so a lot of Confederate rhetoric tends to center around that matter of what we are doing is basically upholding and sort of paying forward the legacy of the right to revolution that gets established with the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution. The kind of flip side of that coin is the New York recruitment poster on the right-hand side, which is, much more bold and dramatic and way more content. But the thing that I really want to point out is the banner that the eagle is holding. It doesn't say, we need to fight to make other men free, right? It's not saying we need to fight to abolish slavery. It's not saying we need to fight to enshrine the ideals of equality and opportunity and freedom. It is saying the Union, it must and shall be preserved, right? So here again, this is another example of the fact that a lot of the rhetoric, in this case on the northern side, is going right back to the legacy of the revolution. And it's saying the founders that created the country in the 1770s and 1780s didn't intend for it to have the ability to destroy itself, right? This argument says the founding generation created a government, created a political institution, a union of states that was undissolvable, that it could not just be broken at the whims of an individual state or a group of states that decided that they weren't satisfied with the operation of the political system that they were a part of. And so both sides are really seeing themselves as the protectors of that revolutionary legacy, that idea that the founding generation enshrined in American tradition aspects or ideas that could be used on both sides of this debate. And on the northern side of the debate, the enshrined political philosophy is the Union is permanent. It's unbreakable. It cannot just be sort of split, or it can't be abandoned or left just because one entity or another is dissatisfied with the way it's operating. They argue the system was created to give all parts a voice, and if that voice isn't strong enough to carry the day, that's just the problem of the system, and you have to wait until another opportunity for your voice to be successful or to be victorious. From the Southern perspective, they tended to focus on one hand on the right to revolution, the idea that if a government isn't reflective and representative of the needs of their people, its people, that those people have a right to replace that government with something that will actually function in that way. They say if it was good enough for the colonies in the Revolution, it's the exact same justification that we can use now to leave the United States and create our own country. The other argument that the Confederacy uses is the idea that the Constitution is a contract, right? That this was an agreement that was entered into by the various states, and those states, if they decide that the terms of that contract are no longer working in their favor, that they should and can be able to break that contract and leave the country. Just like if you are in a contract for an apartment building or a contract in a business sense, if the terms of that contract are violated, In theory, legally speaking, you can break that contract, and that's essentially what Confederate states are saying in this case, is that the agreement that they entered into as various states in the 1780s when the Constitution was being ratified, that agreement is now null and void. And so the people in those states have decided to leave the United States. And so that's basically what the Civil War sort of centers around. And yes, at the root of that is the question of not just states' rights. It's not just, oh, well, we have the right to decide our own future. The right that the states were concerned about in the Confederacy was the right to maintain and expand slavery into new territories, to maintain slavery in their own state and then also to expand it into new territories. And so that definitely is at the center of this. And so I don't want to make it sound like I'm trying to offer this revisionist kind of history that says, oh, well, slavery wasn't the cause of the Civil War. Slavery was absolutely the cause of the Civil War. But the expression of what the war represented to a lot of people at the time did not incorporate slavery into that narrative or into that rhetoric. And that has to be recognized. So we've talked a little bit already about some of the different events that have been leading to the ultimate sort of cataclysm of the Civil War. We talked about the Dred Scott decision, we talked about Kansas-Nebraska Act, touched a little bit on the raid at Harper's Ferry in October of 1859. All of those things are building pressure. So if you think of it kind of like blowing up a balloon, every time you keep adding more air into the balloon, it's adding more and more stress. The thing that actually pops the balloon, right, the thing that actually puts all of this into the realm of unavoidable, basically unavoidable warfare, is the election of 1860. And the election of 1860 is one of the most significant elections in all of American history. You know, presidential historians, political scientists can point to a number of different elections that for one reason or another are hugely, hugely important in the progress of American history. It would be hard to argue that there's one that is more important than the election of 1860. 1860 sees the election of Abraham Lincoln to his first term as president. But it is a very interesting example of sort of the way the Electoral College can play a massive role in election results without necessarily, how to put this? So the whole conversation that has been going around in the last 5 years or so about the Electoral College, is it good or is it bad? Arguments exist on both sides. It's not my place to say whether it's right or wrong. The election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln gets barely 40% of the popular vote. So he doesn't even get a majority of the popular vote. He gets the most of any of the four candidates who are running for president, but he does not get the majority of the vote. Lincoln wins the presidency because he wins states that give him enough electoral votes that he crosses that finish line in a way that guarantees him the presidency. And the reason is, even though Lincoln does not appear, and the Republican Party that he is a part of does not appear on the ballots of 10 southern states, you cannot even vote for Abraham Lincoln or any Republican candidate for office in 10 states. Even though Lincoln is not even an official candidate in any of these states, because he carries all of the North, and because the northern states have higher electoral votes, electoral counts, Lincoln manages to win. He gets 180 of the electoral votes. That puts him over half of the electoral college, and that's enough to guarantee him the win. So it's a fascinating kind of statistical anomaly in American presidential history. And it does fit into this question, even down to today, about, well, is this the right or wrong way of choosing a president, having an electoral college? This is an interesting example of an instance where a president wins not even by not winning the popular vote. Technically he does. He gets what's called a plurality. But he does not get a majority of the popular vote. The thing that makes this election so significant at the moment is the fact that many southern states were looking at this particular election as sort of a decision point. If Lincoln were elected, these southern states, South Carolina being in the lead, would see that as evidence of the North's purpose to abolish slavery, right? They saw Lincoln as a radical abolitionist, somebody who would use the full power of his office and the full power of the government to end slavery once and for all. And they believed that if Lincoln got elected, that would be proof and danger that their way of life would soon be eliminated. Lincoln, for his part, made very clear multiple times that he was not a radical abolitionist. He was personally, by this point, against slavery as an institution, but he did not believe that he had any power to influence slavery one way or the other, right? Lincoln was a lawyer, and Lincoln knew that the only thing that could end slavery's existence was a constitutional amendment, and he knew that he alone could not do that. He could not make that happen. But, you know, people have a tendency to vote based on what they think they hear, and not necessarily based on facts. That's an issue that has existed really throughout American history. And so this was no different, right? Lots of Southerners believed that Lincoln was a radical abolitionist, despite the things that he actually said. And so the election of 1860 was seen as this breaking point to officially signal that the South had to leave the United States. So that process begins with South Carolina. December 20th of 1860, they officially withdraw from the United States. Before too long, the rest of the Deep South, which you're looking at places like Georgia and Mississippi and Louisiana, they follow along. And by the beginning of the year 1861, Lincoln is still not president, right? He's been elected in November of 1860, but he's not going to take office until March of 1861, because that's when the inauguration was at the time. And he is coming into a country that is fractured, right? It's split, basically east to west, right down the middle. And so Lincoln is confronted with quite a challenge. The challenge only gets worse when the upper South, which would be states like Virginia and North Carolina and Tennessee, when they leave the United States, this is an even bigger blow for a number of different reasons. For one thing, these are the states that will give the glimmer of hope to the Confederate cause, right? These are states that have larger populations. They have the bulk of what little manufacturing the South actually had. And so their decision to join the Confederacy means that the Confederacy has a much greater chance of survival. Geographically speaking, the decision of Virginia to leave the United States is also significant because the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., is partially surrounded by Virginia as a state. And so this is going to be one of the real kinds of pickles that the northern side is faced with, especially because it's going to play into some of the grand strategy that the Confederacy decides to implement by 1862 and 1863. So the decision of states like Virginia and Tennessee and North Carolina to join the Confederacy means that they do then have the possibility of success. We'll talk a little bit about the ebb and flow of how the war progresses, but you can see here the blue are the states that are free states. The gray are states that are slave states. So it's not just the gray is the Confederacy, because one of the other unusual kinds of circumstances of the American Civil War is there are 4 states that are part of the North, that are part of the Union, that are slave-holding states: Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland, right? And so it's not just a matter of all the free states were fighting all of the slave states, because there are slave states that are part of the Union, that are part of the North during the war. Now, those states, in some cases, will end up abolishing slavery during the war, or will begin the process of ending slavery during the war. But an interesting kind of example of how slavery fits into the flow of the war, early in the war's progress, the military governor that Abraham Lincoln installs to be in charge of Missouri decides all on his own that he's going to free the slaves. His name's John C. Fremont. Fremont decides, you know what? I don't like slavery. I'm going to free all of the slaves in Missouri because that's just the right thing to do. And Lincoln is furious. Lincoln actually re-enslaves the people of Missouri who had just been freed, because Lincoln says, what I need right now is Missouri to be part of the Union more than I need to have the slaves freed in that state. So it's a much more complex kind of situation than just go for the North. They're the ones that are working for freedom and liberty, and those dirty, nasty, rotten Southerners are only fighting to support slavery. It's a much more involved kind of situation than that would otherwise indicate. So this is where we're going to break here, right at the sort of eve of the Civil War. Our next section is going to talk about the beginning stages of the war, how the war kicks off, and some of the early struggles that the North faces as they're trying to kind of get their feet under themselves in the process of the war. So I hope everybody's doing well. Make sure you get in touch with me if you've got questions about anything, and I will see everybody soon.